At the very source of the Mississippi River, in the cold lake country of northern Minnesota, the United States Army Corps of Engineers did something almost no one realizes was ever done. They reached up to the headwaters of the greatest river in North America at its very beginning, and they put it under human control. In the 1880s, they built a chain of dams across the Great Lakes at the top of the river, by hand out of timber and stone, catch the spring flood and hold it back and let it out slowly through the dry months downstream. The engineering worked, and it still works. Flow of the Mississippi is shaped at its source by those dams to this day. But this is a story with two true halves, and I am going to tell you both, because to tell only one would be a lie. To store all that water for the sawmills downstream, engineers had to raise the lakes upstream. And when the lakes rose, the water climbed up over the wild rice beds and the fishing grounds and the homes and the graves of the Ojibwe people who had lived in that country for centuries. This is the story of an engineering triumph and what it cost, and both are real. I have been reading the Army Corps records and the Ojibwe accounts of the Mississippi headwaters dams. This time the record keeps names on both sides of the story. So let me give you the anchors before we begin. The first is Charles Allen. Captain Charles J. Allen was the Army Corps of Engineers officer in charge of the St. Paul district, who completed the survey and wrote the proposal, convinced Congress to fund the dams. He looked at the cluster of huge natural lakes at the top of the Mississippi, Winnebagoshus and Leech Lake and the others, and he saw in them a gift to an engineer. In a report to the Chief of Engineers, he put it in a line that has stuck with me. The lakes at the source of the Mississippi, he wrote, furnish a compact reservoir system, almost as if laid out by an engineer. That was the whole idea in a sentence. Nature had already built the reservoirs. All the Army had to do was put a gate on each one. Allen is the engineering anchor of this story. Other anchors stood on the other side of it, and the record, to its credit, kept their names too. They were the leaders of the Ojibwe bands whose land the rising water would take. One was a chief at Leech Lake, the records call Flatmouth, and when he understood what the dams would do, he said, in words that were written down at a council in 1883, if these dams are made, we will all be destroyed. He refused the small payment the government offered, saying simply, as this is our property, we will not accept a small price. Another was a chief of the Mississippi bands called White Cloud, and when he was offered a few cents an acre for the flooded land, he answered with a dignity that cuts right through the years. As poor as I am, he said, if forced to take this money, I would take it and throw it away. Allen saw a reservoir system laid out by nature. Flatmouth and White Cloud saw their homeland about to go underwater. Both of them were right, and that is the whole hard truth of this story. Allen was part of a great wave of American river engineering in those decades. Era when the Army Corps of Engineers turned its full attention to the rivers of the interior, charting them, clearing them, walling them with levees, and here damming them at the source. It was the beginning of a project that would run for a century, the long American effort to take the continent's wild rivers and make them behave, to stop them flooding and keep them flowing on a schedule that suited commerce. The headwaters dams were one of the early moves in that long game. And this was not the only place where the rising water went over land that belonged to native nations, because the low river valleys and lake shores that made the best reservoir sites were exactly the places people had always lived. What happened at Leech Lake and Winnebagoshus was not a freak event or a single bad decision. It was the leading edge of a way of thinking about rivers and land that would shape and flood a great deal of the country across the 20th century, and the Ojibwe of the headwaters were among the first to feel it. If you care about the people whose lives were changed by the things this country built, the ones the history books leave in the margins, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back. To understand why the Army wanted to dam the headwaters at all, you have to understand the problem of the upper Mississippi, which is a problem of timing. First though, picture the place, because most people have never thought about where the Mississippi actually begins. The greatest river on the continent does not start as a great river. It starts as a modest stream flowing out of a lake called Itasca in the north, woods of Minnesota, and from there it wanders north and east through a whole country of large, shallow glacial lakes before it ever turns south and grows into the river we know. This is flat, watery, forested land, dotted with lakes and laced with wild rice marshes, the kind of country a canoe crosses more easily than a wagon. The big lakes up here, Winnebagoshus and Leech Lake and Cass Lake, and the rest are like a string of natural basins near the top of the watershed, catching the snowmelt and the rain of the north and feeding it slowly into the infant river. That is the geography Captain Allen was looking at. Before the Mississippi is a river of steamboats and cities, it is a chain of quiet northern lakes, and that is where this story happens. The river is fed by the snows of the north, and so it runs in a great cycle. In the spring when the snow melts, the river roars, high and fast and full, and then through the dry late summer it falls, sometimes so low that boats grounded on the sandbars and the river became almost useless for moving anything. Down at Minneapolis, at the Falls of St. Anthony, an enormous industry had grown up that depended on that river, the sawmills cutting the timber of the north into lumber, and the flour mills grinding the wheat of the plains, all of them needing the river to carry logs down, and to keep the channel deep enough for traffic. Minneapolis in those years was becoming one of the great industrial cities of the country on the strength of that river and that waterfall. The Falls of St. Anthony were the only major waterfall on the Mississippi, a natural source of power, and around them had grown up the largest concentration of sawmills and flour mills in the United States. The pine forests of northern Minnesota, the same north woods where the headwaters lakes lay, were being cut at a furious pace, and the logs were floated down the rivers to the mills to be sawn into the lumber that built the prairie states. The wheat of those same prairies came to Minneapolis to be ground into flour by the most advanced mills in the world. All of it ran on water power and water transport, and all of it suffered when the river ran low in late summer. To the men who owned those mills, a steadier river was worth a great deal of money, and money on that scale has a way of becoming a government project. The dams at the headwaters were, in the end, a public works program with a private purpose, and the purpose lived at the Falls of St. Anthony, far to the south of the lakes that would be raised. A river that flooded in spring and dried up in summer was a problem worth a great deal of money to solve. And the solution, as Captain Allen saw, was sitting right there at the top of the watershed, in the form of those huge natural lakes. If you could hold back the spring flood in the lakes, and then let it out slowly through the dry months, you could even out the river, store the water when there was too much, and release it when there was too little. In 1880, Congress agreed and funded the building of the dams. It is worth understanding how a reservoir dam like this actually works, because it is different from the dam we usually picture. It was never meant to be a wall holding a permanent lake for power. It was a valve. In the spring, when the snowmelt came roaring down, the gates were closed, and the lakes filled and rose, swallowing the flood that would otherwise have run wastefully down the river all at once. Then, through the dry summer and fall, the gates were opened a measured amount, and the stored water was let out slowly, propping up the river downstream when it would naturally have fallen low. The lake was the bank account, the spring flood was the deposit, and the summer release was the withdrawal. Done across 6 big lakes, it gave the Corps a real, if limited, control over the flow of the upper river to soften nature's wild swing between flood and drought. It was a genuinely clever idea, and on its own terms it worked. The whole catch, was that the account was filled by raising the lakes over land that belonged to people, and keeping the account full meant holding those lakes high through the very seasons the Ojibwe most needed the shorelines. What they built over the next several years was a system of 6 dams across the great headwaters lakes, and the first and largest of them went up fast. The dams at Lake Winnebagoshish, at Leech Lake, and Pokegama Falls were built between about 1881 and 1885. Then came dams at Pine River and Sandy Lake, and finally, much later, at Gull Lake. And these first dams were not the great concrete monoliths we picture when we think of a dam. They were built the way you built things in the remote North Woods in the 1880s, out of timber and rock and earth, by hand. The men framed great cribs of logs, sank them, and filled them with rock and earth to hold back the water. The dam at Winnebagoshish alone took something like 2 million board feet of pine, and the labor of around 300 men, working in one of the most remote corners of the country, well over 100 miles north of Minneapolis, hauling everything they needed up into the wilderness. Think about what building in that place meant in the 1880s. There were no roads worth the name into that lake country, no railroads yet to most of it. The cut timber for the cribs, the tools, iron for the gates, the food for hundreds of men, all of it had to be hauled north into a roadless wilderness of forest and water, and then assembled on site, often in brutal cold, because in that country the building season is short, and the winter is long and savage. The men framed huge boxes of logs, the cribs, floated or skidded them into position across the outlets of the lakes, and then sank them by filling them with rock and earth, building a barrier the water could not push aside. It was the same basic method that had dammed streams since ancient times, timber and rock and human muscle, scaled up to hold back a lake and carried out at the far edge of the settled country. The dam at Winnebagoshish, with its 2 million feet of pine and its 300 men, was a major construction project dropped into a wilderness that could barely be reached, and it held. It was a real feat of construction in a hard and isolated place, and when the gates were closed, lakes began to rise. Let me tell you how far they rose, and I want you with me at the boss tier while I do, for $4.99 a month. Badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to the water. The dam at Lake Winnibigoshish raised the level of that lake by 14 feet. 14 feet does not sound like much until you remember that these are huge, shallow northern lakes, and that raising a shallow lake by 14 feet does not just deepen it, it spreads it, pushing the shoreline far out across the low country all around it. Winnibigoshish today is the 5th largest lake in Minnesota, around 67,000 acres of water, and a great deal of that size is water the dam put there. All across the headwaters, the rising lakes drowned the low shorelines, and the low shorelines were exactly where the Ojibwe lived and worked. This is the part of the story that the engineering reports tend to pass over quickly, and I am not going to. The Ojibwe of the Headwaters country, people of Leech Lake and Winnibigoshish and Cass Lake, lived in a close and ancient relationship with those shorelines. Above all, there was the wild rice, the manoomin, the sacred grain that grows in the shallow water at the edges of the northern lakes. The Ojibwe had harvested from canoes for countless generations, and that was at the very center of their food, their economy, way of life. It is hard to put into a few words how central the wild rice was, but I will try with respect, because you cannot understand what the flooding meant without it. The Ojibwe have an old story that their ancestors were told to travel west until they came to the place where the food grows on the water, and that the wild rice marshes of this lake country are that place, the journey's end, the home they were meant to find. Every autumn, families went out in canoes into the rice beds, one person pulling the canoe slowly through the standing rice, another gently bending the heads over the boat with cedar sticks and knocking the ripe grain loose, the way it had been done for centuries and is still done today. The rice fed them through the winter. It was central to their trade. It was woven into who they were as a people, and wild rice is a particular plant. It grows in shallow water, a couple of feet deep, in the quiet margins of the lakes. Raise the water level by several feet, and the rice cannot grow. It is not damaged. It simply drowns and does not come back. So when the engineers raised the lakes to store water for the mills, they were not just flooding some acres of low ground. They were drowning the single most important resource of the people who lived there, food that grew on the water, the thing their whole history had told them to come and find. Wild rice grows in shallow water. Raise the lake several feet, and you drown the rice beds, and they are gone. The rising reservoirs also flooded the shallow fisheries the people netted, the hay meadows where they cut grass, low ground where they had their homes, and in places the very graves of their dead. The water that was being stored up to serve the mills hundreds of miles downstream came up over the heart of the Ojibwe homeland. This was not a side effect that nobody foresaw. The chiefs had said plainly, before the dams were built, what would happen. If these dams are made, Flatmouth had said, we will all be destroyed, and then the dams were made. The councils where this was argued out are part of the record, and they are painful to read. The government sent commissioners to the bands to explain that the water would rise and to offer payment for the damage, and the chiefs answered with a clear understanding of exactly what was about to happen to them, and a refusal to pretend a few cents an acre made it right. They knew the rice beds would drown. They knew the graves of their relatives lay on the low ground that would go under. They said so plainly. They asked for a fair price and for the promises to be kept. What they got at first was an offer so small it was almost an insult, and a process in which the decision had, in truth, already been made far away in Washington and Minneapolis before they were ever consulted. The water was coming whatever they said. The councils were less a negotiation than a notification, and the chiefs knew it and said that too. There is a particular kind of powerlessness in being told that your home will be flooded for the benefit of a city you have never seen, and being offered pennies, and knowing that your refusal will not stop the water. That is the position Flatmouth and White Cloud were speaking from, and it gives their words their weight. I want to be careful and fair here, the way this channel always tries to be, because it would be easy to turn this into a soul story of villains, and history is rarely that simple. The men of the Army Corps were not setting out to destroy a people. They were solving an engineering and economic problem the nation had handed them, a clever and genuinely impressive system to tame a great river. And here is a detail that holds the whole tangled truth of it in one image. According to the Army's own account, some of the men who built these dams who framed the cribs and sank the rock and raised the gates, were Ojibwe men themselves, working for wages on the very structures that would flood their own country. They built the thing that took their home. The ledger of that work kept the count of the board feet and the days of labor. It did not keep the names of those men. It almost never does. Before I go on, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old history like this one unless enough people click. One click, and then come right back. There is one more hard irony in this story, and it is an engineering one. After all of that, after the dams and the flooding and the loss, the reservoirs did not actually do the downstream job they had been sold to Congress to do, at least not well. The whole project had been justified as an aid to navigation, a way to keep the Mississippi deep enough for boats in the dry sign. But when an Army engineer named Henry Boss studied the results and testified them, in 1898 the truth came out. In a serious drought, he said, all those reservoirs together raised the river down at St. Paul by little more than a foot. Lake Pepin, the effect was hardly noticeable at all, a foot. The river was simply too big and St. Paul too far downstream for the headwaters lakes to change it much. What the dams actually did and did well was serve the timber and the mills, holding water to float logs and turn the wheels at Minneapolis. The navigation argument had been to a large degree the public reason. The lumber industry was the real one. So the wild rice beds of the Ojibwe were flooded, in the end, less to float the steamboats of the nation than to feed the sawmills of one city. One quick note, I turned the full story into a book, Everything the Records Gave Me. If you want it, the link is in the description. The Ojibwe did not simply accept the loss, and the fight over it lasted almost unbelievably for a century. From the very beginning, the bands demanded fair payment for the land the water had taken. A federal commission, totaling up the flooded acres, offered them a sum of about $15,000, a few cents an acre, the offer that White Cloud said he would take and throw away. The bands refused it and demanded far more, and the grievance did not go away. It was carried by the Leech Lake people through generation after generation, a debt the government had never honestly paid. And then finally, in 1985, more than 100 years after the dams first flooded the rice beds, the United States settled. In an agreement reached out of court, the government agreed to pay the Leech Lake Band more than $3 million, Woodard, calculated for 178,000 acres of reservation land that had been taken or flooded, with interest reckoned all the way back to 1884. It took 100 years, but the debt was at last acknowledged. That is a rare thing in this kind of story, and it belongs in it. Think about what 100 years of carrying that grievance means. The people who stood at those councils in the 1880s, Flatmouth and White Cloud and the others, did not live to see any of it made right. Neither did their children, in all likelihood, nor in many cases their grandchildren. The memory of the flooding, of the promises and the pennies and the drowned rice beds, was handed down through generation after generation of the Leech Lake people as a wrong that had never been answered, until at last, in a different century and a different America, the descendants of the people who had been flooded out forced the government to settle the old account. The dollars, more than 100 years late and reckoned with a century of interest, could not bring back rice beds or undo the loss. The settlement was an admission on the record that the thing had been done and that it had been owed for. In a story with very little justice in it, that 100-year-late acknowledgement is the closest thing to a just ending the record offers, came only because the Ojibwe refused, across 5 generations, to let it be forgotten. As for the dams themselves, they are still there, still working, which is the strangest part of all. The timber cribs of the 1880s were rebuilt in concrete over the years, but the system Captain Allen proposed still stands at the source of the Mississippi, 6 dams on the great headwaters lakes, and the Army Corps of Engineers operates them to this day, now for flood control and recreation and wildlife as much as for anything downstream. More than 140 years after a young captain looked at those lakes and saw a reservoir system laid out, as if by an engineer, his idea is still holding back the spring flood at the top of the river. The dams have been rebuilt and modernized over the years. Original timber cribs gave way to concrete around the turn of the 20th century, sturdier structures on the same sites doing the same job. Purpose has shifted too. The great Minneapolis sawmills are long gone, the pine they cut is long gone, and nobody floats logs down the upper Mississippi anymore. So the dams no longer serve the industry they were really built for. Today the Corps operates them for flood control, to protect the towns and farms downstream from the spring rise, and for recreation and wildlife on the big lakes they created. The reservoirs have outlived their original reason for being and found new ones, which is the fate of a great deal of durable infrastructure. The structure turns out to be so useful that it stays. Long after the world that built it has changed past recognition, the engineering endured. So in their way did the Ojibwe, who are still there at Leech Lake and Winnebagoshish, still harvesting what wild rice the lakes will still grow, still keeping the memory of what the water took. And the wild rice does still grow. In the beds the higher water did not entirely take. And every autumn, Ojibwe families still go out in canoes to harvest the manuman the way their ancestors did. One person poling slowly through the standing rice, and another knocking the grain into the boat. The dams could raise the lakes and drown a great deal, but they could not drown the people, or the practice, or the memory. It is a kind of quiet endurance in that which is its own answer to the whole sad arc of the story. Engineers came and measured and dammed and moved on. The mills they served boomed and busted and vanished, and the people the water rose over are still there, still on the lakes, still ricing in the fall. If you want to know who truly belongs to that country, that is your answer. There is something almost mythic about the whole idea, when you step back from it. To stand at the source of a great river and put your hand on its flow, to decide how much water the Mississippi will carry 1,000 miles downstream by opening or closing a gate in the North Woods. Kind of power that earlier ages would have called the work of a god, and America did it almost casually as a public works project for the benefit of some sawmills. That is the scale of confidence this country brought to its rivers in those years. Flat assurance that a river was a machine to be adjusted, and that the people who happened to live at the point of adjustment were a detail to be settled with a payment. The engineering was genuinely magnificent. The assurance behind it was something else, and the drowned rice beds of the Ojibwe are where you can still read the cost of it. Here is the thought I will leave you with, and you can tell me in the comments whether you think I have it right. We usually tell the story of American engineering as a clean triumph, problem solved, a river tamed, and the men who did it as heroes, and the headwaters dams really were a clever and durable piece of engineering by hard, skilled men in a brutal wilderness, and they really do still work. But this story will not let you stop there, and I think that is good. Because the same rising water that was a triumph for the engineer and the miller was a catastrophe for the people whose rice beds and graves went under it, and the only honest way to tell it is to hold both of those at once. The river was made to serve one place by being raised over another. That is not a reason to tear the dams down or to stop admiring the engineering. It is a reason to remember the whole story, the gate and the flood, the captain and the chiefs, the lake that was raised and the people it was raised over. History is not a list of triumphs. It is a record of what we did, all of it, and the dams at the source of the Mississippi are a place where the triumph and the cost are still standing in the same water. I think that is why this story matters more than a simpler one would. It is easy to love the clean stories, the bridge that still stands, lighthouse that still shines, the pure triumphs of hand and mind. This channel is full of them, and they are real. Not every great work was a clean triumph, and an honest history has to make room for the ones that came at a price somebody else paid. The headwaters were a real engineering achievement and a real act of taking both at once, the very water that proves the one also covers the other. To remember only the captain and his clever reservoir, and to forget Flatmouth and the drowned rice beds, would be to tell half a story and call it the whole. I would rather tell all of it. The river was tamed at its source. A people paid for it. Both are true. The lakes are still high. The rice still grows where the water will let it. The dams still stand. That is the country we actually built. And I think we owe it to everyone in the story, the engineers and the chiefs, and the nameless men who raised the cribs, to remember the whole of it, and not just the half that flatters us. The captain's reservoir and the chief's drowned rice beds are the same story, told from two ends of the same rising water, and you do not really understand either one until you have held both. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shoutout in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss Tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.